And I'd like to introduce our brave speaker for the night, Priscilla Blanchard. She is our interim president of the Historical Society, and her presentation is titled The Emma Cronin Case. Or she has a new one. And it's about a murder that occurred in the Waverly House Hotel, which is our museum. So please give her a warm welcome and cheer periodically.
You don't need to jeer. Okay, do I need to hold this then?
Yes. Close to it.
I don't want to be that close to it. Okay, so to be clear, this is not the ghost story. Everybody thinks that I'm going to tell the ghost story. It may lead into a slight ghost story. This is the story of Emma Adeline Wallet. She was born in 1860 to Benjamin and Lucinda Wallet. Her father was one of the first settlers to Lamont, Minnesota. And in 1862, he was deemed insane, and he died in 1863. Her mother, once he was deemed insane, was unable to care for herself and 2 children, so the children were fostered. Emma's foster parents were Henry and Victoria Watkins in Humboldt County, Iowa. Victoria was a school teacher. On the display board, there's a picture of the Bellows School where Victoria taught. The big news at the time was the Adair train robbery by the James Gang in 1873. It happened about 100 miles south of Emma's home. Emma married a widower, Bartholomew Cronin. He was born in County Cork, Ireland at Castle Carrigaline, and Emma became mother to his 4 children. The Humboldt Cosmos printed a blurb regarding their nuptials that shows just how wonderful the news media can be. Miss Addie Watkins was married to Mr. Barney Cronin last week. The bride's probably 16, while the groom cannot be less than 40. Out of respect for her friends, we refrain from comments for the present at least. In 1880, Emma is 20 years old, and her stepchildren here, Mary was married in 1880, Anna was married in 1879, Michael was 16, Barney was 12, and now she had her own children by Bartholomew, James Charles, who was 1, and she was expecting Margaret May. Her husband, Bartholomew, died in 1882, leaving Emma with James and Mamie. Emma chose to become a teacher, just as her foster mom had been. She enrolled in the Humboldt Academy and Normal School to study with Professor McClung. She couldn't study and care for the children, so she chose to take them to the St. Mary's Orphans Home in Dubuque. This was not simply to be rid of them. She would retrieve them later when her studies were completed. In preparation for her train journey, it was a 4-hour train journey just from Waterloo to Dubuque. And with 5-year-old James and 3-year-old Mamie, Emma bought a pistol at John C. Merrill's dry goods store. I have a similar pistol over there on my table. Just a little thing. On the train, Emma met a man who presents himself as Mr. Kane, a single man living in Fort Dodge with his mother and sisters. In actuality, he's John Franklin Stevens, a lineman with Western Union Telegraph. Stevens is also traveling with a co-worker, Charles Stockdale. Stevens manages to talk Emma into making a short detour to Waverly. in order to have a rest before continuing home. The Illinois Central arrives in Waverly, and the Star Brothers omnibus delivers Emma, Jan Stevens, and Charles Stockdale to the Bremer House at 3 a.m. on Tuesday, June 5th, 1883. What she didn't know was that Stockdale had signed the guest book as Bollinger from Chicago, and that Stevens had signed it as H.A. Johnston and wife. The court testimony from Emma concerning what happened next. Kane stepped inside the room with my basket. The landlord stepped out and right across the hall, and I think he said this way to that young man Stockdale. This Kane set down my basket and remained in the room from 3 to 5 minutes, a short time anyway. He stepped out of the room, and before he went out, he said, "Good night. I'm going to room with Charlie." When he stepped out, I shut the door and locked it. I took off my shoes and my corsets and fastened up my dress again. In a few minutes, I heard the man rapping at the door. He shook the door and told me to open it. I told him I would not. He said he only wanted to say a few words and say good night. He said his partner had locked the door and he could not get into his room. He said he was going down to call the landlord and tell him to give him another room, or else he was going to leave the house. Said he would not say anything wrong to me, and I need not be afraid to let him in. I opened the door and he came in and lay down on the sofa. I told him to go out. He said he wouldn't. Said he had lost just as much sleep as I had, that I needn't be afraid of him, that he wouldn't say anything wrong to me, that he would act the gentleman. He then pulled off his shoes and laid on the back of the bed and turned the quilt over him. He swore an oath before God and man that he wouldn't say anything wrong to me, nor in any way molest me. He then pretended to sleep. I locked the door again. I hadn't any sleep since Saturday night, was very tired. I sat down on the foot of the bed and afterwards fell asleep. This man Kane woke me up. He had hold of me in such a way with both his hands that I couldn't move. I begged of him to let me up. Now the newspaper inserts this. The witness here describes a violent struggle during which she appealed to Stevens in vain for mercy, called aloud for help repeatedly, and upon God and the Virgin Mary for protection, but the recital is necessarily of a character that is not admissible in a family paper. The testimony goes on. I then got my right hand away from him and got it in my pocket, and got this revolver and cocked it, and fired without taking aim. He was partly over my breast when I fired, and his hands dropped and he fell over the bed. I then jumped up. I didn't think I'd hit him. I then saw the blood coming out of his head. I ran downstairs and called the landlord and told him that I had shot a man, that he'd better go for a doctor, that perhaps he would live. Now, I don't know if many of you realize the layers involved in taking advantage of a woman in 1880s. Hit the play button, please. This is what's involved, and you don't even see her putting on the shift, the pantaloons, the corset, and the fichu. The only thing that she took off was her corset and her shoes. The next thing that happened was big news. It was all over the place, all over Iowa, and all the way to Chicago. There was evidence produced that showed their conduct on the train from Waterloo to Waverly was not proper, and showed that they were on the most intimate terms with each other. There was other evidence that seemed to show no struggle had occurred. The Waverly Democrat reported Persons who were first on the scene after shooting say that both the murdered man and the woman were under the influence of liquor, and the old adage, wine and women ruin many men, has again been demonstrated. The Cedar Rapids Gazette said, this writer has seen several documents from citizens of Humboldt County that show conclusively that at her home, Mrs. Cronin has always been considered a good and virtuous woman. From Pastor Case to Livermore. I wish in the interest of humanity and justice to make a plain statement of the unfortunate occurrence that has recently taken place here, by which Mrs. Cronin is plunged into deepest sorrow. I took pains to hear the testimony in supposing that she was guilty beyond all recovery. But when I heard the testimony, I became thoroughly convinced that she had good and sufficient reason for doing as she did. And being thus convinced, my conscience would not let me do otherwise than to defend her to the utmost of my ability. Even the pastor had gone in, assuming that she was just incredibly guilty. Emma's bail was set at $2,000. Can anyone tell me how much that would be now? A cajillion is very close. It was over $50,000 in today's money. Several families in her hometown, however, provided $250 each. And in today's money, that's $6,300 per family. Thankfully, they had lots of friends. Emma's foster father hired the best Waverly attorneys, Gibson and Dawson. The state spent 2 hours expounding on how Mrs. Cronin had prostituted herself, that Mr. Stevens had no difficulty on the score of overcoming her virtue. Mr. Dawson took 3 hours, and Mr. Gibson occupied 5 hours, painting a picture of an innocent and unsophisticated country girl whose very verdancy and implicit trust in the goodness of mankind had led her to overstep the bounds of propriety and fall into the toils prepared for her by a designing man gifted with a potent intellect but destitute of moral attributes, and who relentlessly used a powerful will to gratify his lustful passions. Public opinion was sickly sentimentalism, or justice is blind, although there were some who said, rejoice, a woman successfully defending her virtue. Some people believe she was an innocent dupe. More do not. If an election were held in Waverly to decide whether a certificate of good moral character should be issued to her, it's our judgment that she would not get the certificate. She was not on trial for a certificate of chastity, however, but for murder. Oh, no, you're fine. It's good. You're good. So, please bring up the lights. I want to know a show of hands. Who feels she was guilty? We have one. Okay, we have 3. Oh, you're just saying that now. And who thinks she was innocent? Overwhelming. On April 20th, 1884, that's a year later, after a 10-day trial and 15 hours of jury deliberation, at 3 a.m., which of course is the same time that they got to the hotel, Emma was found not guilty, and she was acquitted. Now, the mystery has been, what on earth happened to her then? Because nobody could find a bit about her. So after a good bit of digging, on December 2nd in 1884, Emma married David Histon in South Dakota. They went on to have 9 children. She ended up with 11 because James and Mamie counted. She lived 88 years, raised 15 children and stepchildren, enjoyed 35 grandchildren, 28 great-grandchildren, and on down the line. Plus, she outlived 2 husbands. And that is what happened to Emma Cronin, and why she is not the one who's haunting Woodbury House. She didn't die there.
Thank you. That's what I'm supposed to say now. Thank you, Priscilla. So that's the completion of tonight's presentation. So I'd like to have a motion to adjourn the meeting. Okay, we'll accept hers and your second. Okay, fair. Is there a question back there? You're just trying to motion.
Just an emotion.
Just got some good motion. Okay. So, all those in favor, say aye. Aye. Anyone who wants to keep us here, say no. Okay, so the ayes have it. A reminder that the Genealogical Society will now meet at the other end of the room here.
No, we'll meet right here. A lot of us are sitting right here.
Right there.
A couple more chairs here.
Okay. Thank you everybody for coming, and we hope to see you next year, if not before.